Okay, hi everyone. Hello and welcome to Queerness and Gothic Literature, Part 2. My name is Matisse Dupont, and I am the programs coordinator for the History Project. And in case anyone is new here to the History Project, well, welcome. We are Boston's LGBTQ plus community archives. We're dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing Boston's queer history. So if you're interested in all in LGBTQ plus history or Boston history, please be sure to follow us on social media and you can learn all about what we're up to. And I'll just drop a link right here into the chat so you all can go ahead and give us a follow. I have a couple of things to announce before the show starts. We're really excited about our community generated history of marriage equality in Massachusetts. We're celebrating the 20th anniversary. We've recently just renamed it the Marriage Equality Collection for a little bit of clarity. And we've created a brand new and improved online forum where people can share all of your sort of memories around LGBTQ plus weddings for the last 20 years. We're really especially looking for photos. So if anyone has any stories or background or any like invitations from your weddings, photos, please feel free to submit them. I've dropped a link in the chat to the form. And now the form for submission is right on this page. You don't have to go anywhere else. So you can just go right to historyproject.org/marriage. And on that page, you can contribute your LGBTQ plus wedding photos right then and there. It's a lot of fun. And we're really excited to see what everyone's got. And my final plug before we dive in is just to say thank you all again for being here, for your support. And as a community archives, we are funded by the community. So I'm here just to ask for your support. Any support to this project directly supports our mission to document, preserve, and share LGBTQ plus history. We've launched our Pride 365 campaign to preserve, protect, and share queer history every single day. This LGBTQ plus history month, which is, we're in the last week of it or so, you have the powerful opportunity to make double the impact of what you normally would be able to, because the Lenny Zakem Fund will match every dollar that new donors are donating, up to $2,500. We're at $2,000 of this right now, so we're 500 away. I'll drop a link to that as well here. So if you want to help us reach that goal, we're just 500 away from the end of our Zakem matching project. And now let's go on to tonight's main event. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Meaghan Michel. This is a part 2, actually. So last year, Meaghan came in to do a talk on queer Gothic history and literature. I've just dropped the link to part 1. Don't watch it right now. You can go back. But if you missed it last year, it's there for posterity and on the record on YouTube. But Meaghan Michel, a dedicated park ranger with the National Park Service, has spent the last 10 years uncovering hidden LGBTQ plus histories. Currently stationed at the National Parks of Boston, she's delved deep into the queer currents running through America's cultural landmarks. Meaghan is also pursuing her degree in public history and literature. So Meaghan, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for always inviting me back to keep ranting about history. Can everybody see the slide? All right, perfect. So yeah, basically this is a part 2 to the talk I did last year. And so I'm just going to do a very brief recap, sort of what we're talking about, to then dive into the history of, queerness and Gothic literature, really starting from the 1860s onwards. So when it comes to what Gothic literature is, it really is a subcategory of romantic literature, and it's specifically supposed to be taboo. It's supposed to be transgressive, it's supposed to be dark. These are not generally happy stories. And a universal thread throughout all different forms of Gothic are things like wild, desolate landscapes, ancient buildings, castles and dungeons, ghosts, isolation. Fear of Catholicism historically was a major motif in a lot of Gothic works. Um, but also dealing with insanity, mental health illnesses, cultural taboos, murder, and it really became a dominant form of literature, especially in Great Britain, the UK, and the United States, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. But it is important to note that these are not the only places Gothic stories are being written. These are just the ones that I personally know the most about, so that's what I tend to focus on. But when it comes to talking about queer Gothic specifically, one aspect of it is that these stories, in many ways, are socially conservative, even if they are talking about transgressive things. Most of these stories do end with the status quo usually returning to normal. Usually, the quote unquote monster is defeated, and the monster in these stories can be metaphors for a lot of different social anxieties based on when they're written. And one of those anxieties that is very common throughout the past 200 years is absolutely the concept of queerness, the fear of queerness, and also just embracing queerness as well. So, American Gothic and British Gothic, there's a lot of overlaps, but they do have things they tend to focus on. Um, British Gothic tends to be set in the medieval era or on the Mediterranean. They don't necessarily take place close to home for most of its history, but in the later part of the 19th century, Gothic horror really does start to come to England itself. And a lot of this is a commentary on the state of the empire and fears over the collapse of British society, British culture. And because of that, there is going to be a lot more literature taking place in England because of it. Meanwhile, in America, a lot of Gothic literature tends to be much more based on the concerns of Americans, unsurprisingly. And a lot of this literature stems from things like religious fanaticism, racial tensions, the wilderness, the occult. And a lot of American Gothic tends to be very internal. So, really focusing on sort of what is happening inside of you. But a lot of American Gothic is also contemporary. These stories are not about something far in the past, it is what's happening right now. And when you get into the 20th century, one of the offshoots of that is going to be Southern Gothic literature. It's something that really starts to come about after the Civil War, but it starts to gain national notoriety really in the 20th century. And what is surprising is that there are a number of Southern Gothic stories that are empathetic to both people of color and queer characters within. But much like with most Gothic stories, these are not necessarily happy endings, even if these characters are treated decently enough by the author themselves. So, with that, we can kind of start to dive into the stories and the authors themselves. And starting off, I think one of the most influential stories that we're going to talk about is definitely Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. It's considered to be the very first lesbian vampire story, and it became an instantly very popular one. As far as Le Fanu himself, there's not a lot really known about his sexuality. We know that he was married and he had a complicated relationship with his wife. There seemed to be a lot of mental health struggles in their relationship. So I don't know, as far as his personal life, what LeFanu was thinking or feeling, but he absolutely is writing a very queer novel in this story. Because the basic premise is the vampire Carmilla becomes a house guest to a wealthy gentleman and his daughter, and she is a vampire. and she starts draining the blood of other young women throughout this community, including Laura herself. But as the story progresses, both Carmilla and Laura do start to fall in love with each other. They start to really form an intimate bond. And even as Carmilla is draining the life from her, at the same time, Carmilla is devastated at the thought of losing her. And it really becomes this shockingly emotional story between these two women. And it also ties in to many of the fears of the time. It's not just the fear of the fact that these women are in love with each other and that it's very heavily coded that there is some form of a sexual relationship between them. It's also the fact that Carmilla is actively working outside of the authority of men, and this is not the norm for this time period. And so she represents just a threat to the patriarchy itself, a threat to the power that men held in 19th century Europe at the time. And this is an era where women did not necessarily have the freedoms to live on their own, to go out and chart their own course in many ways. And so Carmilla offering Laura an alternative to that was something that was very dangerous, and it's something readers would have picked up on. And so this inspired countless other vampire stories and countless movies throughout history as well. And it is going to serve as a source of inspiration for another vampire book that we're going to be talking about a little further along. But the next figure to talk about is going to be Robert Louis Stevenson. He's most well known in terms of Gothic literature for The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, also known for Treasure Island. And based on a lot of research I've been digging into, he was definitely devoted to his wife. It seems like he really had an interest in women, that was undeniable, but he also attracted the attention of other men. It seems that he never reciprocated that attention, but he enjoyed getting it. As one of his friends wrote about him, Mr. Stevenson possessed, more than any man I ever met, the power of making other men fall in love with him. And that's just one of the things that was said about him. He was also part of a very queer social circle as well. Some of his closest friends included people like John Singer Sargent and Henry James, who we're also going to be talking about later. But the story of Jekyll and Hyde can be interpreted in a lot of ways. It's written so ambiguously that people attach countless meanings to this story. But one interpretation that is a popular one is that there is a queer reading to this story as well. Whether or not that was what Stevenson's intention was, doesn't change the fact that when you read this story, these themes do pop out. And part of it is that all of the male characters in this story are middle aged bachelors. They are all devoted to each other. And there is almost no female representation in this book. Any female characters are very minor, usually the servants, or occasionally a sex worker working the streets of London, but none of them are directly characters in the story. They don't really get much say or representation in the work. And it's also definitely the other metaphors of leading a double life, how Dr. Jekyll becomes Mr. Hyde. And the very first transformation, Dr. Jekyll wakes up in bed as he's transformed into Mr. Hyde. It's a very interesting place for that transformation to occur. And there's also a ongoing subplot between Dr. Jekyll and his friends, where his friends don't understand the relationship he has with Mr. Hyde, but they're referring to Hyde as Jekyll's favorite. Dr. Mr. Hyde is described as a young man who, for some reason, seems to be blackmailing Dr. Jekyll into getting his inheritance. And all of the friends around him question why Dr. Jekyll is going along with this. What blackmail does Mr. Hyde have over him that he is willing to completely change his will to include it in that? The reader understands that the answer is that they're the same person, but his friends think that there's something else going on, and it's a very queer interpretation just from that alone. But in the end, this is also going to be impacted by what is happening in England at the time. But before we get into that, the other figure I want to talk about is Vernon Lee. And Vernon Lee was definitely one of the most prolific lesbian writers of the late 19th century. And she lived rather openly. She wrote a number of Gothic novels, Gothic short stories. She was also a philosopher. She was also a critic. She wrote a lot of nonfiction as well as fiction. And she was known for dressing in very masculine clothing, and she was known for her affairs with other women. And even in her own stories, the female characters, often similar to Vernon Lee herself, defy the social mores of the time period. And one major example of this is in her work, The Phantom Lover, because one of the characters in this story enjoys dressing in men's clothing, but specifically Elizabethan era men's clothing, and also becomes the object of obsession for another woman in this story. And it's not ambiguous. A lot of Vernon Lee's work is explicitly lesbian. It doesn't really hide it. And part of that definitely can be attributed to the fact that during this time period, women were expected to have close relationships with other women. They were expected to have romantic friendships, but they weren't expected to stay in those relationships. It was the expectation that they would get married, that they would settle down, but that's not something that Vernon Lee herself ever did. And her writing definitely reflects that. So that's just one example. Definitely recommend A Phantom Lover. It's a very interesting short story for sure. But that does lead us to the wider cultural context, because women definitely faced a lot of discrimination for their sexuality, but a lot of times this was something that was ignored. Women were not supposed to really even have a sexuality. And so debates over women who had relationships with other women, women we would consider to be lesbians, didn't get the legal ramifications during this time period that men often did. It was under the radar, but that doesn't mean it was still a good situation. But for men, things were going to be a lot more dangerous, especially in the later 19th century, because for most of this time period, laws against homosexuality were targeted at the sexual act itself. But in order to be prosecuted, it had to be proven. And that was often a very hard thing to do. But in 1885, the Labouchere Amendment was passed, and this labeled all acts of homosexuality as gross indecency. And it allowed the government to prosecute men with or without evidence of any sort of acts occurring. And no definition of gross indecency was actually written into the law, which allowed the judge, juries, prosecution to really get away with a lot more than they would have otherwise been able to. And it also became known as the Blackmail Charter because the result of this was, because you didn't have to prove it, you just had to basically prove that this person had tendencies at all. And so it really started a long line of blackmailing and scandal, and all of this was happening around the time period that Jekyll and Hyde came out. So when Jekyll's friends are concerned that Jekyll is being blackmailed, something that would have been on the minds of a lot of readers would have been this charter right here. And then not long after, there was a very scandalous moment in 1889 when a male brothel was raided on Cleveland Street in London, and it implicated a lot of prominent members of British society. Many of these men actually had to flee to France and other parts of the continent to avoid prosecution under the amendment. So this really was having a rippling effect down the line. And it's also going to have a major lasting effect on the Gothic literature of this time period as well. Most famously, Oscar Wilde himself. The Picture of Dorian Gray is Oscar Wilde's only novel. He's mostly well known for his plays and his short stories, but this was Oscar Wilde actively telling an explicitly queer story. And from the beginning, it was censored. It was not even published in its original form. The publishers cut out a lot of what he had written. But even so, the novel still was very controversial, and it was considered very amoral. So much so that later on, during Oscar Wilde's trial, the picture of Dorian Gray is actually used as part of the evidence against him as being gay. And the basic plot line of this story is that Dorian Gray has captured the heart of a painter named Basil, and Dorian sells his soul for eternal youth and lives a very hedonistic lifestyle afterwards, as Basil is doing what he can to try to basically make Dorian Gray come back to the light. But because it's a Gothic novel, unsurprisingly, this is also not going to have a happy ending. But Oscar came from a very radical family. His family was very involved in socialism, as was Oscar Wilde himself. He was very into artistic philosophy, and he became especially well known for his relationships with other men. The most significant being with Bosie Douglas and Robbie Ross. And he was actually imprisoned under the Labouchere Amendment for gross indecency, as the law put it, specifically at the accusation of Bosie Douglas's father. So there was a lot happening with that. He spends 2 years doing hard labor, which was the maximum sentence for this at the time, and he never really recovers his health after this. So It's not even until very recently that Oscar Wilde was actually pardoned under this law, so he only just got a pardon a few years ago. But showing a bit about the story itself, I just have a very quick example of what was originally published versus what Oscar Wilde had initially written. Because what was published was, "From the moment I met you, your personality had the most extraordinary influence over me." What he had initially written was, "It is quite true I have worshipped you with far more romance of feeling than a man should ever give to a friend. Somehow I have never loved a woman." And the story is filled with countless examples of this. This is just one of them. But Oscar Wilde's trial and imprisonment had a major effect on his social circle as well, because there were so many other authors and artists who were guilty of the same thing Oscar Wilde was. And after his imprisonment, it really created a scare among his friend group. One of them being Bram Stoker. And I've talked a lot about Bram Stoker in the past, so I won't dive too deeply into this. But Stoker and Wilde shared the same social circle for years. They were both born in Ireland. They both went to the same school. They both interacted constantly. And even when they were living in England together, they spent a lot of time together. But the trial and backlash against Oscar Wilde really was a major influence in forcing Bram Stoker fully back into the closet. He had never publicly come out, but there was a lot of writing and evidence that he did feel same-sex attraction. He had a very intimate relationship with Henry Irving, the famous actor. He also confided a lot in Walt Whitman when he was a younger man. Um, and the fact that he was in Wilde's circle at all really did implicate him in a lot of this drama, which is definitely a major reason why, after the trial, Bram Stoker starts to distance himself. He never really speaks of Wilde or to Wilde again after that. But it's right after this trial that Bram Stoker begins really diving into writing Dracula for the first time. And he had started writing it in 1890, but it's 1 month after the trial that he really starts to dive in. And this is an extremely queer coded novel. There are countless examples throughout the novel, but one of the most prominent aspects is definitely the relationship between Count Dracula himself and Jonathan Harker. One of the very first lines that Bram Stoker ever wrote when writing Dracula is the phrase, "This man belongs to me." But when he initially wrote it, it was a bit different. He had written, "This man belongs to me. I want him." And the relationship between Dracula and Jonathan Harker is very coded in a traditional Gothic way, where Jonathan Harker is more filling the role of a Gothic heroine than a Gothic hero. He is the one who is captive, he is the one who is being held hostage by the vampire. But ultimately, it is going to be Jonathan Harker, along with his wife and his friends, that does ultimately defeat Dracula as well. But to talk a bit about sort of the influence of Walt Whitman, I do just have a couple quotes from some of the letters that Bram Stoker wrote to Walt Whitman that really hints that there is something in terms of his sexuality. Things like, I shall be able perhaps to say what I cannot write. You have shaken off the shackles and your wings are free. I have the shackles on my shoulders still, but I have no wings. And I have been more candid with you, have said more about myself to you than I have said to anyone before. You will not be angry with me if you have read so far. You will not laugh at me for writing this to you. I don't think you will laugh, Walt Whitman, nor despise me. But at all events, I thank you for all the love and sympathy you have given me in common with my kind. Walt Whitman was one of the most famous queer men in America and in during this time period. And Whitman would have known exactly what Bram Stoker was sort of alluding to. So the fact that after Wilde's trial, Bram Stoker completely backtracked, honestly, kind of became incredibly homophobic after the fact as well, was actually a very common response to what was going on. But another figure also in Oscar Wilde's circle, whether he wanted to be or not, was Henry James. And Henry James is most well-known Gothic work, and his only Gothic work is The Turn of the Screw. It is something he basically wrote to pay the bills. He did not have much of an interest in Gothic literature, but he figured he could write it. And it's a very interesting novel in that this is a time period where there still is a bit of a distinction between American Gothic and English Gothic, but Turn of the Screw is kind of a combination of both of these things. It's a very ambiguous novel. It has all of the trappings of a traditional ghost story, similar to a lot of British Gothic novels at the time, but there's always the question of, is the governess herself just losing her mind? And that's a very internal view that a lot of American Gothic literature had. And so he's really striking an interesting balance and also kind of turning the story and a lot of the tropes on its head, because the end of this story stays ambiguous. There's no real conclusion to this story. He doesn't answer the question one way or another. Things do not return to the status quo. It's actively forcing you, the reader, to decide what the truth actually is. And James is also going to be very well known mainly for his other novels. He writes a lot about especially high society in Boston, in England, and sort of the trials and tribulations that follow that. But one of the novels he writes is The Bostonians, which was partly inspired by his sister Alice and her partner Catherine, as well as by his friends Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett. And the term Boston marriage was inspired by this novel. And so James himself was surrounded by women that we would consider to be lesbian or bisexual today. And a lot of his friends tended to be women in these upper class Boston marriages. But there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that James himself did have relationships with other men as well, including Hendrik Anderson and William Morton Fullerton. And so I do have a little quote, one of my favorite quote letters that Henry James ever wrote, where he's talking to Morton Fullerton and he writes, "You are dazzling, my dear Fullerton. You are beautiful. You are more than tactful. You are tenderly, magically tactile, but you are not kind." And so Henry James would have been a part of this circle as well. He was definitely contemporaries with Bram Stoker, with Oscar Wilde. He was a friend of Robert Louis Stevenson. He absolutely despised Oscar Wilde, though. They had a rivalry. It was kind of one-sided because Oscar Wilde never seemed to hate him as much as Henry James hated him. But what I find really entertaining is after he was released from prison, apparently Oscar Wilde did read The Turn of the Screw, and apparently he really loved it, which is something I feel like Henry James would not have appreciated at all. But Henry James really leads us into the 20th century. And it leads us really to a series of more women writers as well. The first of these being Daphne du Maurier. She wrote a lot of Gothic stories, horror stories, but the most famous queer one is definitely the story Rebecca. And du Maurier came from a very prominent literary family, and she was really primed to follow in the family footsteps of doing something artistic. And she really took to writing from a very young age. But as she was growing up and throughout the rest of her life, gender and sexuality was a constant complexity in her life and also a major point of contention. Growing up, she described herself as a disembodied spirit. As a child, she believed to be a boy soul placed in the wrong body. And as an adult, it seems like, based on all of her writings, she did identify as female, but she did talk about really having two personas within him. A female persona that she presented to the world, but then there was something internally very masculine and male about her that she felt is what she put into her actual writing. And throughout much of her life, she would have same sex relationships with other women. And even after she got married, she continued to flirt with women as well. But throughout her life, she did not want to be referred to as a lesbian. She referred to herself as bisexual, so that's definitely how I would be most comfortable referring to her. The other way she described her sexuality was as her Venetian tendencies, which I also think is just a really funny way to describe her bisexuality. But Rebecca itself is interesting because when it was published, it was billed as a romance novel, which is not at all what this story was supposed to be. Du Maurier referred to it as a study in jealousy. And I won't spoil too much of the story, but basically, the new wife it has moved into this Gothic mansion where she is haunted by the former wife, Rebecca. Everywhere around her, the house is Rebecca's. Everything in this place belongs to Rebecca, and she's really oppressed by it. And she's also very oppressed by the housekeeper, the personal maid of Rebecca herself. And it seems like Mrs. Danvers, this maid, had some sort of erotic relationship going on with Rebecca while she was still alive. And so there's one scene where Mrs. Danvers is leading the new bride through the house and is showing her Rebecca's clothing, including her underwear. And this is something that the movie from the 1940s also really leans into. But even at the time, there's something very interesting about the underclothes, the underwear being something that Mrs. Danvers has to show off. But that then leads us into the war era, World War II. And in the aftermath of that, we're going to be shifting gears away from England and moving firmly into the United States. And one thing that really kicks off in the 1940s is the Lavender Scare. It's really a time period where, at the start of the Cold War, the government began purging queer employees from their federal jobs, whether it was in the military or in the civilian sector civil service. And the main justification for this was that gays and lesbians during this time period were viewed as security risks. It's the same problem that has come up with every other oppressive law leading to this point. If being blackmailed for your sexuality is so easy at this point, it's become a national security concern that queer employees could be blackmailed by the communists, by the Soviet Union. And so the view was to just eliminate them from the workforce entirely. And it's also during a time period where homosexuality was viewed as a mental illness, which was also something shifting public perception. It was also an era of a very conservative backswing, really placing pressure on traditional gender roles, the nuclear family, American traditional values. And the pendulum really started to swing against queer people during this time. Whereas throughout World War II, it was not great, but there was starting to be, at the very least, more community starting to form around this time. And before the Lavender Scare, there was actually starting to be a major queer scene in Washington, D.C that is almost completely destroyed as a result of this. When the Navy actually does an investigation on this, they find that doing this, casting out queer federal employees, doesn't actually do anything to help national security because they weren't a national security risk to begin with. But the federal government will continue to hide this report for another 20 years. And the results of this are that between 5,000 and tens of thousands of gay workers lost their jobs and continued to face unemployment, exclusion. Many people had their lives ruined because of this. And because of all of this, it's also going to shape the literature of the era as well as how the gay community is going to start organizing. And that leads us really into the final generation we're going to be talking about. The first being Truman Capote. He is not as well known for Gothic works, but he did write one known as Other Voices, Other Rooms, right in 1948, right at the start of this Lavender Scare. And the basic plot of this is that a young man named Joel Knox travels through a series of haunted houses to basically discover himself. And then at the end of the story, he decides to rejoin the nuclear family. He decides to go back to bigger society, and that being queer, embracing who you are, is what the haunted thing is what the terrifying thing is. Unsurprisingly, this is not a happy story, but it is a very traditionally Gothic one. But it was also very controversial because the main character was explicitly queer, and also because of the author photo, which we do at least have a minor crop of here. Um, because author photos were not supposed to be the authors lounging a little seductively on a couch, but Truman Capote was really pushing the boundaries of the time. But he became much more famous later on for his work, his rivalry with another gay writer, Gore Vidal, and his just incredibly messy relationships with mid 20th century high society. He was definitely an interesting person, but he was very openly gay, and a lot of his work is a direct reflection of that. Carson McCullers is also similarly going to write an explicitly queer work. But this is even before World War II. She's more well known for The Ballad of the Sad Cafe, but it's really Reflections in a Golden Eye that is explicit. It's all about an army private who's obsessed with an officer's wife, while the officer is obsessed with the army private. And many of Carson McCullers' works really deal with empathy, isolation, really focusing on the misfits and outcasts living in the South during this time. And she herself really understood this. She did have romantic relationships with women. She was also married to the same man twice, and this was, by all accounts, an often very abusive relationship. So, in between her marriages, she mostly had relationships with other women. And one of them was with her therapist, Dr. Mary Mercer. Ethically, definitely would not be okay today. But at the time, because homosexuality was so medicalized, it really became an important relationship in her life, even though by today's standards, we probably would not want a therapist dating their patients. But she also had a very sort of tumultuous and in some ways one-sided relationship with Anne Marie Schwarzenbach, where she wrote, "She had a face that I knew would haunt me for the rest of my life." So McCullers is a really great example of a much more inclusive Southern Gothic literature, but she's not the only one. And there's a surprising one in Flannery O'Connor, because unlike Carson McCullers, who did have same sex relationships, by every account, Flannery O'Connor was straight. She was a devout Catholic, but she also had a lot of lesbian friends. And she's a very contradictory figure. She was very supportive of Martin Luther King Jr., very supportive in the fight for integration, while also actively being vocally racist. And she never tried to justify how those two things fit together. And a lot of her works are definitely a reflection of that. It's filled with empathy while at the same time still being very negative as well. And that's definitely a constant throughout a lot of Flannery O'Connor's works. But there's one story in particular called A Temple of the Holy Ghost that was included in her collection of Gothic tales. And this was a story that was published in the 1950s, and it features an intersex character. And this character views their gender, the way they were born, as a divine gift from God. And it's not the intersex character that Flannery O'Connor makes out to be the villain in the story. It's actually the religious leaders that cast this character out. And the language is definitely dated. It's not the easiest read in the world, but it is an interesting story that this Southern woman living in the South in the 1950s is depicting an intersex character with integrity. And the character even says, "Raise yourself up. You are a temple of the Holy Ghost. God made me this way, and I don't dispute it. This is the way he wanted me to be." And I feel like a lot of that especially ties into her relationships with other queer people. one of the most significant being a woman named Betty Hester. Betty Hester actually was fired during the Lavender Scare. She was a worker for the federal government. She actually served in the armed forces during World War II, and she was fired for being a lesbian. And after a few years of their friendship, Betty ultimately decided to come out to Flannery O'Connor. And this letter here was Flannery's response. And again, this is a letter that she is writing in the 1950s where she talks about how it doesn't make a difference to her. It's impossible for me to let you go. You've done nothing but good. I have a spiritual relationship with you, and no matter what, you know my love is real and I have admiration for you. So, despite being a devout Catholic, she still fully accepted Betty Hester as she was, which again shows the nuance and complexity of this very complicated woman. And that's really reflected in a lot of her writing. And then the final person to talk about before we wrap up, Shirley Jackson, because she is probably the queen of the horror novel. And a lot of her works are very New England Gothic. It goes back to New England Gothic with an emphasis on the domestic sphere and how a lot of her stories feature outsiders really being persecuted by the environment they're in. And her most famous work is probably The Haunting of Hill House, where four people meet in a haunted house to do a study of the supernatural. And one of these characters, Theodora, is heavily coded to be a lesbian. She gets into a fight with her roommate that is not specified of gender, and this is what causes her to decide to leave and go to this haunted house. And her relationship with the main character, Eleanor, is a very tense one. There's something unspoken between them. And it's something that the narrative even talks about how nothing irrevocable had yet been spoken, but there was only the barest margin of safety left between them. And so there are definitely some academics who view this novel as a metaphor for the fear of coming out. Throughout the narrative, Eleanor is attracted to men, but her intimate relationship is with Theodora. And when she is forced to leave the house once and for all, Eleanor would rather die than go back into society that she no longer feels she belongs in. And so there's a lot of queer themes and readings to this story. So as we wrap up, once you get into the 50s and 60s, there's more formal organizing, there's more public protesting. It was starting to become more visible in the news, in movies, in books, and the Stonewall Uprising in 1969 really serves as a major flashpoint for the queer liberation movement. And it also opens the doors for a lot more explicit queerness. It's no longer something that needs to be coded. It doesn't need to be a metaphor. It can be explicit and it can be depicted both positively and negatively. And most importantly, this is really an era where more voices are gaining recognition. And so it's really starting in the late 60s onward that you're going to hear more trans voices, more African American voices, more people of color in general. And it's really going to be this next generation that leads us to the Gothic literature that we still have today. So, with that, I think I can stop sharing this PowerPoint. And I am good to go for any questions and wrap it up.
Thank you so much, Meaghan. That was wonderful. Yeah, just want to be mindful of the time. It is 8, so if anyone needs to take off, please feel free to do so. But so happy to stay on for an extra couple moments to facilitate some Q&A. Meaghan, that was wonderful. Everyone, I see we're giving a lot of rounds of applauses from the audience here. So it's this was really great. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to either raise your hand and come up, or you can uh, just unmute yourself and start talking, and I'll spotlight you. Yes, Madeline, go ahead. I'm gonna spotlight you.
There we go. Hello. So I was wondering about, you mentioned I think it was the La Boucher Amendment.
Yes.
Was that passed in England? Where was that at?
Yes.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, that was passed in England, so it didn't affect the United States. I should have mentioned that, so I appreciate the question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. As
Thank you.
I was also kind of in my head, I was putting together the history of Gothic literature with my own history, my own knowledge of the history of the medicalization of transness in like Europe,
Hmm.
US. And it's fascinating how much of those two histories meld together very well, I would say.
Oh,
But
for sure.
um yeah, just as far as like um the types of Gothic literature and where they were located in one place or another. So interesting. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Madeline, for that wonderful question. Going once, going twice. Anyone else? Well done, well done. Oh, we got one from the chat. Meaghan, what is your favorite book? Specifically, I would love to know what's your favorite Gothic queer horror novel, if you got one.
My favorite is definitely Dracula. I had to restrain myself. I kind of skimmed over Bram Stoker because I've talked about him before, but I can rant about Dracula all day. It is 1000% my favorite.
Yeah, Dracula's great. Have you ever seen the illustrations that Edward Gorey did about Dracula for the plays
They're
that he did?
so good.
They're so good. Another famous gay. Wonderful. Okay, everyone. Meaghan, thanks again so much for being here with the History Project, and we're so glad we got to hear this talk. Everyone, give Meaghan another round of applause. And yeah, everyone, thanks for coming, and have a great night. And thanks, Meaghan.
Thank you.
Ciao, everyone.